Welcome to Reformed Thinking. I'm so glad you're joining us today. So, imagine you were trying to translate a hostage negotiation, right?
Oh, boy. That sounds stressful.
Yeah, it is. But imagine your dictionary tells you that the word for broad daylight is actually the identical word used for the pitch black of night, depending on, which century the speaker happens to be from.
That sounds like an absolute nightmare for a translator.
It really is. And that is the kind of linguistic nightmare translators face when they encounter ancient languages.
Right.
We tend to assume a word like day is just a fixed mathematical reality. You look at a digital clock, the sun is up, so it is daytime. The categories are very neat and clean.
Yeah, we like our neat categories.
But when you look at ancient Hebrew measurements of time, that digital clock just shatters.
It really does. It falls completely apart.
So today we're taking a stack of highly specific technical source materials. We are talking about advanced biblical Hebrew lexicon entries and commentary notes. And we are going to extract the hidden architecture beneath the text.
It's going to be a fascinating deep dive.
Definitely. Our mission for this deep dive is to look at the anatomy of two specific ancient words. First, Yomam, meaning by day, and second, Yowan, which translates to Javan or Greece.
And through these two words, we are going to see how ancient language shaped the perception of time and geography and really human action itself.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because looking at advanced Hebrew dictionary entries, it sounds like a really dry academic exercise to most people.
Oh, absolutely. It sounds like something you'd only do in a graduate seminary class, but doing so actually pulls back the curtain on how the ancient mind categorized reality.
Yeah.
When we consult lexicons like the Theological Word Book of the Old Testament or Brown Driver Briggs or the modern scholarly dictionaries in our sources, we're looking at the bare bones of human perception.
So where do we even start with a word like Yomam?
Well, the sources hand us a mystery right away regarding this word, and it centers on something you would assume is a basic objective fact, which is counting.
Counting. That is what initially caught my attention in the notes, and frankly, it baffles me.
It's pretty strange, right?
Yeah, because we are dealing with a closed, ancient text. The words are set in stone, or well, at least set in ink on parchment.
Right, they aren't writing new books of the Hebrew Bible.
Yeah. Yet, looking at the source material, there are glaring discrepancies in the basic data. One lexicon states that Yomam appears 150 times in the Hebrew Bible.
Right.
Another entry states it appears 50 times, and then a third source gives us 53.
It's a pretty wild spread.
How can world-class scholars, people who dedicate their entire lives to this single language, disagree on a basic word count?
It seems impossible.
If I ask someone to count how many times the word day appears in a modern novel, they just hit Control F and get a hard number. Why are these experts handing us three wildly different tallies for the identical word?
So that discrepancy gets to the very heart of how Semitic languages function. It depends entirely on what a lexicographer considers the base word.
Okay, so it's a definition problem.
Yeah, exactly. Or rather, precisely. It's about whether you count a variant, a text critical correction, or a grammatical shift over centuries as the same word.
Got it.
Biblical Hebrew is built on a root system, usually consisting of three consonants. The base root word for day is yom.
Which most people probably recognize from Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement.
Yes, spot on.
Yeah.
So our specific word, yomam, is composed of that base root yom plus a suffix, im. The scholarly debate centers on the origin and the function of that specific suffix.
Well, the whole counting problem is because of those two little letters at the end.
Basically, yes.
Yeah.
The sources note that a prominent linguist named Karl Brockelman, in his major grammatical works, identifies that ending as a, quote, survival of mimation.
Okay, stop right there. What in the world is mimation?
Right, it's a highly technical term. Mimation is a grammatical feature found in much older ancient Semitic languages, like Akkadian.
So language is older than Biblical Hebrew.
Much older. In those ancient languages, words often ended in an M sound to indicate certain grammatical states. It's much like how Latin uses different endings for its nouns to show if it's the subject or the object.
Okay, that makes sense.
But over centuries of linguistic evolution, those M endings just dropped off. People stopped using them.
So finding one in Biblical Hebrew is...
It's akin to finding a dinosaur bone in your backyard. It is a leftover piece of a much older language structure.
So Brockelman sees it as an evolutionary leftover. But I imagine not everyone agrees with that assessment, given the varying word counts we talked about.
You'd be correct. It's highly debated.
If it is just a leftover piece of an older language, does it still hold grammatical weight? Or is it just a dead letter hanging onto the end of the word doing nothing?
That is the big debate. Other grammarians, specifically Bauer and Lander, argue it is not just a dead fossil of mimation. They argue it is a fixed adverbial ending.
Meaning it actually serves a purpose in the sentence.
Yes. They point to similar structures in related languages, like the Aramaic word Yomam and the Syriac word imo, both of which mean daytime.
Oh, interesting.
They argue the am suffix makes the noun function specifically as an adverb, answering the question of when something happened.
Okay, so it turns day into during the day or by day.
Right. So when scholars sit down to count the word, they have to make a theological and grammatical choice. Do you count every instance where the letters Y-O-M-A-M appear?
Which would give you the big number.
Yes. Or do you only count the ones where it functions purely as an adverb modifying a verb? Do you exclude verses where the grammatical structure is ambiguous?
So that is why one scholar counts 150, looking at the broad biological family tree of the word.
Yeah, and another counts 50, looking only at its specific functional job in a given sentence.
Think about the English word daily. We all know what it means. But if you dissect it, you have the base word day and the suffix "-ly".
Right, that's a great comparison.
That "xi" is actually a linguistic fossil from Old English. It was originally delic, L-I-C, which meant having the form or likeness of something.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, so daily literally meant having the likeness of a day. But we never think about that history when we use the word today.
No, we just say it.
The history is stacked inside that single word, hidden from the modern speaker. These Hebrew lexicons are doing that same dissection, just on a scale of millennia.
That's a perfect way to put it for our listeners. It's digging through the layers of history stacked inside single words.
So understanding how Yomam is built structurally naturally leads to the question of when it applies chronologically.
Because day is a very elastic concept in the ancient world.
Highly elastic, based on the sources. If I tell you we are meeting during the day, that implies noon or mid-afternoon, broad daylight.
Yeah, I'd assume we're getting lunch.
Right. But the lexicon points out that in Job chapter 24, verse 18, Yomam is translated specifically as at dawn.
That's a very different time of day.
Are dawn and broad daylight mutually exclusive in ancient timekeeping? It seems contradictory to use the same word for the very first crack of light and the blazing afternoon sun.
Well, to understand that, you have to discard our modern timekeeping devices entirely. The boundaries of ancient time were defined by observable physical phenomena and human participation.
So, not by abstract numbers on a dial.
Not at all. When Job 24.18 uses Yomam to mean dawn, it is describing the initiation of the day. Dawn is the active shattering of the night.
The active shattering. I like that phrase.
It is the specific moment the physical world becomes visible and usable again. Contrast that with the source's reference to Ezekiel chapter 12, verse 3.
What happens there?
In that passage, the prophet Ezekiel is commanded by God to pack his bags and dig through a wall, quote, in broad daylight. And the Hebrew word used is yomam.
Dig through a wall in broad daylight.
Yeah, and the text explicitly contrasts this action with the evening. The reason he must do it in broad daylight is that it is meant to be a public, visible spectacle.
Because the rebellious people need to see him enacting this prophecy of exile.
Exactly. This reveals a crucial distinction in the semantic range of the word. The sources differentiate between daylight time, which is the physical period between sunrise and sunset.
Like we see in Leviticus 8.35.
Right, and what they categorize as day awake.
Day awake.
Yeah. Jeremiah 8.23 talks about a person weeping yomam, meaning during the waking hours when humans are not sleeping.
The hours reserved for labor, activity, and consciousness.
Yes. The ancients measured time by human labor and visibility, not by clocks.
The connection to human consciousness and labor makes the emotional weight of these texts so much heavier.
It really changes how you read it.
The lexicon directs us to Jeremiah chapter 15, verse 9, which contains the phrase, "While it was yet day, the sun went down."
And the Hebrew phrase there uses yomam.
Yes. So when you consider that daytime is defined by human action, visibility, and the capacity to work, then the sun going down while it is yet day is a massive catastrophe.
It's terrifying. It represents a life cut short, a sudden, unnatural end to the working hours.
The daylight hours were precious. They were the only time a person could secure their survival in an agrarian society.
You cannot harvest wheat or mend a roof in the pitch black.
Right. Light equaled life and productivity. So if the daytime is defined by human action and visibility, Pairing it with the night must signal something total.
Something that escapes the normal boundaries of human limitation.
Yeah. And the sources show a heavy reliance on pairing Yomam with Layla, which is the Hebrew word for night.
That pairing is extremely common, and it carries massive theological weight regarding the nature of God and human endurance.
How so?
When the text pairs Yomam and Layla, we are looking at a linguistic device known as a merism.
A merism.
Huh?
For those listening, a merism is a figure of speech where two opposite extremes are used to encompass the entirety of a thing.
Right, including everything in between those extremes.
The sources provide several striking examples of this. In Exodus 13.21, we see the pillar of cloud leading the Israelites Yomam by day, paired with the pillar of fire by night.
This demonstrates God's relentless protective presence that does not adhere to human schedules. He doesn't clock out.
And in Psalm 1.2, the righteous person meditates on the law, Yomo Lila, day and night.
We also see the reverse phrasing, night and day, in Deuteronomy 28.66 and Isaiah 34.0.
By linking the time of human labor with the time of human rest, the text creates a concept of unbroken, constant time.
Continuous time that completely transcends normal physical limits.
In our modern idiom,
Yeah.
saying I work day and night is just a figure of speech. It's like saying I searched high and low.
Yeah, you didn't literally check the top of a mountain and the bottom of a valley. You just mean you looked everywhere.
It is hyperbole. But looking at the sources, this ancient merism seems much more literal and physically demanding.
Especially regarding the sacrificial system.
Yes. In Leviticus 8.35, the priests are commanded to sit at the entrance of the tent of meeting day and night for 7 days.
That is not a poetic way of saying be diligent.
No, that represents an exhausting, unbroken physical reality of their mediating duties. The psychological impact of that unbroken time must have been immense.
Oh, without a doubt. You mentioned Jeremiah 8.23 earlier, where the prophet talks about weeping day and night over the destruction of his people.
Yeah, the weeping.
When you add the night to the weeping of the day, you remove the normal human relief of sleep. You erase the biological boundary that gives the mind a chance to reset.
That erasure of boundaries is a terrifying prospect in the ancient worldview.
Nighttime was designed for cessation. It was designed for doors to be locked, for labor to cease, and for vulnerability to be mitigated by hiding in the dark.
So to weep day and night means the grief has breached the natural defenses of the created order.
Yes. The sorrow does not respect the setting of the sun. It is an all-consuming state.
This brings up another really fascinating element from the source material regarding boundaries.
The grammatical boundaries.
Yes. While Yomam acts as a poetic measurement of time, the lexicons show it acting very strangely on a grammatical level. It essentially shape-shifts into different forms that break its own established grammatical rules.
It does. As we said earlier, the word functions mostly as an adverb, modifying a verb, like saying, he walked by day.
But the dictionaries note that it sometimes acts as a substantive.
Hey, a noun.
It even receives prepositions. The sources point to Nehemiah chapter 9, verse 19, where it appears as biomam.
And the prefix be in Hebrew is a preposition meaning in or with.
That seems like a massive redundancy to me.
How do you mean?
Well, if the word yomam already has that adverbial fossil ending that makes it mean by day or in the daytime, then attaching the be preposition to the front to make it biomam is literally saying in by day.
Or in the daytime.
Yeah. Why would a biblical author write that? It feels analogous to someone writing PIN number or ATM machine today.
You are repeating the function that is already built into the word itself.
Right. Did the authors of these later texts just lose track of how their own language worked?
Well, it is actually a perfect demonstration of linguistic progression and drift.
Linguistic drift.
Yeah. Nehemiah is a much later text compared to the early books of the Pentateuch. Over the centuries, that fossilized adverbial ending, the M suffix, lost its strict adverbial force in the minds of the later writers and speakers.
So they forgot what the ending meant.
Sort of. They no longer intuitively felt the by or the in that was historically baked into the suffix. To them, the word had drifted into being a standard noun for daytime.
So to make it function the way they needed it to in a sentence, they just attached the standard preposition be to clarify it.
Exactly, turning it unambiguously into in the daytime. This shows us that biblical Hebrew was a living language that shifted over generations.
That makes a lot of sense. We see another striking example of this grammatical shape-shifting in Ezekiel 30.1c.
Where Yomam is put into the genitive construct.
Right. The source material translates that specific phrase in Ezekiel 30.16 as Zare Yoma.
Which means foes of daytime, or daily enemies.
Let's look at the mechanics of that because it's fascinating. The construct state in Hebrew essentially fuses two nouns together to show possession or relationship.
It creates an X of Y relationship.
So you take the word for foes and fuse it with the word for daytime, creating an incredibly chilling image.
It really is. Instead of an attack coming under the cover of darkness, which is the standard expectation for ancient warfare, ambushes, and banditry.
These are enemies so brazen, so confident in their supremacy, that they attack in the light.
They do not need to hide their malice. They are the foes of the broad daylight.
The linguistic shift creates a vivid picture of human depravity and an unstoppable military force.
It's terrifying poetry.
It is. But while Foes of Daytime creates a clear picture, the ancient text sometimes hands scholars a phrase that seems to make no sense at all. This leads us to what is probably the most controversial part of the source material. According to one of the lexicons, translating the current Masoretic Hebrew text of Psalm 13, verse 3, literally as by day, yields a, quote, lame sense.
That is a strong phrase for a lexicon to use.
I chuckled when I read it, the scholarly shade of calling a biblical reading lame.
When a world-class dictionary explicitly states that a literal reading of the received text yields a lame sense, it pulls back the curtain on the meticulous science of textual criticism.
So they aren't just insulting the text.
No, the scholars are identifying a structural anomaly in the poetry. In Psalm 13.3, the literal Hebrew reads something like, "How long shall I take counsel in my soul, having sorrow in my heart by day?"
And the commentators listed in our sources, specifically Mitchell Dayhood and Peter Craigie, look at that line and spot a severe problem.
A problem with the poetic parallel structure. Ancient Hebrew poetry does not rhyme sounds, it rhymes ideas. It balances semantic weight.
So if the psalmist is expressing absolute, overwhelming grief, limiting that grief only to the daylight hours feels incomplete.
Exactly. It breaks the expected cadence of the lament. Therefore, the lexicon suggests either adding the word wulala, meaning and night, to complete the merism,
or reading the Hebrew word as yom, which means daily.
Mm.
But wait, are commentators like Dayhood and Craigie just allowed to fix a text because they think it sounds awkward?
That is a very common objection.
Changing the ancient text just because a modern scholar thinks the poetry sounds lame seems incredibly arrogant. How do they justify that?
It's a valid question.
If I read a poem that intentionally breaks the rhythm to create a jarring effect, and 1,000 years later a scholar fixes it to make it smooth, they've actually destroyed my original intent.
Right.
We believe these texts carry immense theological authority.
Mm-hmm.
So, altering the words based on a perceived awkwardness feels like a dangerous game. Are these scholars just guessing based on their modern aesthetic preferences?
It is a totally valid concern, and it is why the discipline is governed by strict objective metrics rather than aesthetic preferences. They are absolutely not guessing.
So what are they doing?
They act as historical detectives. They piece together fragments from multiple ancient cultures to reconstruct the most probable original reading.
Okay, so they have actual data.
Yes. When scholars like Dayhood or Craigie suggest an emendation, they rely on external data. For instance, the sources mention looking at ancient translations, specifically the Greek Septuagint.
It's a translation made a couple of centuries before Christ.
Exactly. If the Greek translators working back then translated that verse using a phrase that explicitly implies day and night, it strongly suggests their Hebrew manuscript contained those words.
They saw words that we don't currently have in our Hebrew copies.
Precisely. Furthermore, the lexicon explicitly mentions Ugaritic.
Let's break down Ugaritic, because I think a lot of people are unfamiliar with how massive that discovery was for biblical studies.
Oh, it revolutionized the field entirely. Ugaritic is an ancient Semitic language discovered in the late 1920s in Ras Shamra, which is in modern-day Syria.
And why does that matter for the Hebrew Bible?
Because the texts they found share a massive amount of poetic vocabulary with biblical Hebrew. By studying Ugaritic poetry, scholars deduced the strict rules of ancient Canaanite and Israelite parallel structures.
So they found the rule book.
Exactly. They discovered standard A-word and B-word pairs. If line A says silver, line B will predictably say gold.
And if line A says day, line B will predictably say night.
Yes. So when Moshe Greenberg analyzes Ezekiel 12.3, or Jack Lundbaum looks at the textual issues in Jeremiah 33.20 regarding the covenant of the day and the night.
They apply these hard-won rules of ancient syntax.
Right. They are trying to deduce whether a tired scribe accidentally dropped a word centuries ago.
The mechanics of how a word gets dropped are fascinating to think about. You have a scribe working by candlelight, copying a text by hand.
It's grueling work.
His eyes move from the manuscript he is reading to the parchment he is writing on. He reads a line that ends in a specific word, writes it down, and when he looks back at the master copy,
His eye accidentally catches the exact same word 2 lines down.
right, causing him to skip everything in between. That is a mechanical error, a haplography. Recognizing that is not liberal tampering with the text.
No, it is forensic accounting for ancient poetry.
You look at the ledgers of related ancient languages like Ugaritic or Greek to find the missing linguistic currency.
That's a great analogy.
Decoding these Hebrew anomalies often requires looking at those Greek translations, which perfectly bridges us to the final lexical entry in our stack.
Right, moving from Yomam to Yuan.
Yes. The source material points out that the Septuagint, the ancient Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible we just talked about, translates Yomam as hemera 32 times.
Hemera being the Greek word for day.
Right. But then the lexicon entry pivots from discussing the concept of daytime to analyzing an entirely different word, yawan or Javan.
And the Septuagint translates Yoan as Helen, Iowan, or Hellas, which means Greece.
Okay, so here's my question. How do we make the leap from a highly specific Hebrew adverb about time, yomam, to a noun about ancient Greek geography, yawan?
The connection lies in the cultural collision represented by the Septuagint translation process itself. It's the connective tissue.
How so?
When Jewish scholars in Alexandria sat down to translate Hebrew words like Yomam into Greek words like hemera, they were physically and intellectually interacting with the very culture represented by the word Yaman.
So they were doing this translation work surrounded by Greek culture.
Yes, and the name Javan originates in Genesis chapter 10, verse 2, in the Table of Nations. It's listed as one of the sons of Japheth.
Right.
In the ancient Near Eastern mental map, the descendants of Javan represented the far-off coastlands, the maritime peoples of the Mediterranean.
Which eventually coalesced into the Ionian Greeks.
Precisely. And tracing the evolution of Yawan throughout the biblical text mirrors the shifting geopolitical landscape of the ancient world.
Think about how names of foreign places in our own modern language evolve based on history.
Oh, sure.
A name can start as a completely neutral map label, just a distant country you had to memorize for a geography test.
Right. It means nothing to you personally.
But depending on historical events, a sudden war, a massive economic alliance, a cultural export, that neutral label can rapidly morph into a loaded, heavy term.
It takes on a whole new life.
The exact same progression happened with Joyvan in these ancient texts.
The sources map out this progression really clearly. If we look at Ezekiel chapter 27, verse 13, Joyvan is mentioned alongside Tubal and Meshech.
Okay, and what are they doing there?
In this context, they are simply trading partners with the wealthy maritime city of Tyre. They are exchanging human slaves and articles of bronze for Tyre's merchandise.
So it is a purely economic relationship at that point.
Yes, the word is functionally neutral, just a place on a map you do business with.
But that changes.
Dramatically. As the centuries pass and empires clash, the usage of the word darkens. By the time we reach Zechariah 9.3, the sons of Joyvan are positioned as direct military adversaries to the sons of Zion.
God speaks of rousing the sons of Zion against the sons of Greece.
And when we look at the sources citation of Daniel 10.20 and Daniel 11.2, Javan has become a formidable eschatological adversary.
The text speaks of the Prince of Greece arriving.
Right. This is a reference to the sweeping conquests of Alexander the Great and the subsequent oppression under the Seleucid kings like Antiochus Epiphanes.
So the word morphed from a distant genealogy in Genesis
To a trading partner
in Ezekiel
to an overwhelming cultural and military threat in Daniel. The scholars translating the Hebrew Bible into Greek in Alexandria were intimately aware of this tension.
They had to be. They were living as a conquered people in a world dominated by the descendants of Javan.
So what does this all mean for us as we look back at this stack of lexicon entries? We have covered a lot of ground.
We really have.
We started by pulling apart a single tiny suffix, that ancient zum sound at the end of Yomam.
And from that one linguistic fossil, we uncovered the mechanics of how grammarians trace the biological family tree of a single word. We saw how the ancient mind defined D-time, not by the objective position of a planet, but by the subjective capacity for human labor.
The act of shattering of the dark.
Yes, we analyzed the theological dread of the foes of daytime, those enemies whose depravity is so bold they attack in the light.
And we watched scholars perform forensic detective work using Ugaritic poetry and the Septuagint to restore the cadence of a heartbroken psalm.
Finally, we tracked how a distant son in a genealogy morphed into the apocalyptic prince of Greece, altering the map of the ancient world.
There is a staggering amount of data compressed into just 2 words.
The main takeaway from all these sources is an appreciation for the vast machinery operating beneath the surface of any translation you read.
Every single translated word you read in a modern text rests on a mountain of scholarly debate, ancient cross-referencing, grammatical shifts, and cultural collisions.
The translators have to weigh the difference between a fossilized adverb and a later noun.
Between a poetic merism signifying endless grief and a literal command for priestly duty.
Or between a neutral trading partner and an imperial threat. None of these decisions are arbitrary.
No, they are the result of centuries of meticulous, rigorous study aimed at understanding accurately how the ancient authors perceived their reality.
And ensuring that reality is communicated faithfully to us today.
Absolutely.
Before we wrap up, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over based on everything we discussed today regarding time.
It's an interesting concept to think about.
If the ancient writers used the word for day to also mean human waking life and the capacity for physical labor, what does that say about how we have artificially separated our concept of time from our concept of human energy today?
Oh, that's a really sharp question.
We treat hours as empty containers we are forced to fill with productivity, regardless of whether our bodies or minds are capable of filling them at that moment. The clock dictates our action.
But for the ancients, the capacity for action defined the time itself.
Exactly. Are we living in a rigid, mechanical time, while the ancients live in a distinctly human time? Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the ancient text. Keep reading, keep questioning, and we will see you next time.